Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to another video. This video is going to be about the two Asian giants, China first, and then we'll move on to the modern country of India and what's happening and what situations are like in both of those countries. If you like this video, if it is helpful to you, make sure you leave a like. To get notifications for when the new videos post, make sure you subscribe. If you have any questions or comments, leave them in the comments below or hit me up on Google Classroom, or send me an email, whatever is going to work to get your questions answered. So let's jump into China in the modern world. In 1973, Chairman Mao died, and when he died, he didn't leave a very clear successor. So there was a period of time during which nobody really knew who was in charge of China, and the Chinese Communist Party took a while to select a new leader to guide China into the future. And the guy that they ultimately chose was the guy that we're looking at here. His name is Deng Xiaoping, or his name was Deng Xiaoping because, of course, he is now deceased. When Deng took over, he inherited a country that was very poor and very backward and not working terribly well. They had very little industry. They had very little food production capacity. Things were not going well when Deng took over in the late 1970s. And in fact, Deng was an interesting guy because he really was a reformer. He had been sent to forced labor camps, or what they call re-education camps, twice under Chairman Mao as a result of his advocating for changes to the way that China worked. And so it's really interesting that this guy who was a reformer and who had to twice be sent to communist re-education camps ultimately became the leader of China. And when he did, he decided that China really needed to start to change fundamentally the way that its communist system worked. And so Deng began the process of reforming China through what we call the Four Modernizations. He said we really need to stop being so ideological and focused exclusively on what the right answer is according to communism, and we really got to start modernizing and updating things. And so the three things that he really focused on updating and modernizing were agriculture. He said we've got to start producing food in a reasonable way that will ultimately help us to feed our people. And so the way that this worked and the way that he increased production was called the responsibility system. On the large Chinese farms, the state-run farms, they would assign people a certain amount of food production that they were responsible for. But the responsibility system ultimately then said, if you produce more than that, you get to keep the extra profit from the additional surplus production that you are able to create. And what that ultimately does is it incentivizes people to work really hard and to try to figure out a way to increase their food production, which is good for everybody because, of course, what that does is it allows China to feed its enormous and growing population. But, of course, most of you guys are thinking real hard to yourselves, but wait a minute, if we give people a profit incentive, that doesn't sound very communist. And of course, you're absolutely right. The way that Deng fixed agriculture was he turned it into a more capitalist system. Now, it was not a capitalist system, but it was a more capitalist system. And it really seems as though the best way and the best reform to make to fix a communist system is to just make it into a capitalist system. The second big modernization of the four modernizations that Deng undertook was to modernize the defense of China, to start investing in new modern weaponry, to not just rely on the overwhelming numbers of soldiers in the Chinese army, but also to start militarily developing industrial production and sophisticated advanced technologies. The third one goes right along with that, and that was the investment that China made into modernizing its science and technology. They started to invest in university structures, they started to invest in education, they really started to invest in research and development of modern, sophisticated technologies that would allow China to increase both its production of agricultural products as well as its defense, and of course then also to help in its fourth modernization, which was industry. Now, the way that Deng fixed industry was also a very interesting one. And of course, it's one of the things that's really allowed China to become the major powerhouse that it is to this day. And what he did when it came to the modernization of industry is Deng created what were called SEZs, Special Economic zones. And in those special economic zones, what was allowed to happen was foreign countries and foreign people were allowed to invest money to build factories. China would provide very, very low cost Chinese labor. Ultimately, the companies would have to pay high taxes to the government of China. But ultimately, what was going to happen was if they made a profit off of their production in the special economic zones, that company got to keep the profit. So, of course, what that means is Deng started to create small islands of capitalism inside of the communist system of China. And here what we see is actually a really interesting graph that shows us the growth in the gross domestic product, the GDP, the economy of the country of China. In the middle of the 1970s there, you of course can see the farm privatization, right, the responsibility system. The red line represents China and the Chinese economies target for the future and where they would have continued to go based on their previous growth trend lines without the reforms that Deng Xiaoping put into place. Because of Deng Xiaoping, of course, what you can see is first with the farm privatization, and then in 1979 with the creation of the first special economic zone in Shenzhen, and then later, of course, with the Shanghai special economic zones, and continuing further on into the World Trade Organization entry in the early 2000s, what we've seen now is explosive growth in the Chinese economy, and things have really gotten better as opposed to the previous communist policies, which were things like the Great Leap Forward and the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution, which really stagnated and ruined the Chinese country and ruined the Chinese economy. The reforms of Deng really made a fundamentally good difference and a positive difference to the country of China. And again, it's really worth remembering here that the way Deng fixed the Chinese communist system was to introduce elements of capitalism, because ultimately that's what really made the difference here. Now, this also created a couple of problems. In June of 1989, people started to push and ask for the fifth modernization. They said, listen, if we can fix communism by making it economically into capitalism, maybe we can also fix communism by making it into democracy. And the fifth modernization that the people of China started to demand in 1989, again, the summer of 1989, was democracy. Now, it started with a student protest, but eventually government workers and even members of the military and trade unions and all kinds of other people decided that they were going to join the protest too. The protest happened in a place called Tiananmen Square, which is right outside of the Forbidden City in Shanghai. And eventually it got to the point where hundreds of thousands of people were showing up in Tiananmen Square protesting in favor of the introduction of real, genuine democracy inside of China. Now, way back there in the background, what you can see is a white statue, a large white statue, staring directly into the eyes of the portrait of Chairman Mao outside of the Forbidden City. And what they built, of course, the protesters themselves, was their own Statue of Liberty. They were really trying to get this democratic system, this idea of civil rights and the idea of jurisprudence and the government following rules and due process and freedom of speech and all those types of things. That's really what they were looking for. However, Deng Xiaoping was not willing to go so far as to introduce real, genuine democracy in China in 1989. And so the government, the Communist Party, which is the government of China, decided to respond and to deal with these protesters severely. And what they did is they called out the army, which led to massacres, and essentially the army went in with machine guns and forced everybody out of the square and murdered people who otherwise didn't want to leave. Now, they also called in an entire tank division to help blockade the people out of Tiananmen Square, and this has led to one of the most famous events in all of Chinese history, at least modern history, which is, as those tanks were rolling out of their forward operating base, a person that we today refer to as Tank Man stepped out from we don't know where. He seems to be carrying grocery bags. He walked out in front of the tanks and just stopped and started to talk to the people inside of those tanks. And eventually what happened is they turned off their tanks and they didn't go in to massacre the people in Tiananmen Square. At that point, Tank Man walked away, and to this day, we really don't know who he is. We don't know if he understands how famous he is, but of course, this photograph is one of the most famous in the world as it relates to the communist government and the Communist Party of China's repression of the people of China. Now, this image is actually illegal in China, and it is blocked by the Great Firewall of China because, of course, the last thing in the world that people in the Communist Party of China want is for the people of China to see what a dedicated individual person can do when they decide to stand up against this overwhelmingly powerful system that the Chinese Communist Party has established in China. So really, really important, and of course it's something that speaks to us because, of course, as an individual, this guy was able to, protect a lot of other people and to stand up all by himself against an authoritarian communist system. Now, the Tiananmen Square protests, of course, were shut down, and of course, democracy didn't happen. And today, this is not something that Chinese people are taught. They're not told about this. They're not really allowed to discuss it. It's something which the government has tried to erase from the history books. And of course, inside of China, they've been remarkably successful at that. When it comes to modern China, a couple of things that we see. First of all, of course, is China had in the late 80s and 70s, 80s, 90s, all the way up until the 2000s, a massive problem with the growth of their population. They had, after 1980, they had over 1 billion people inside of the country of China, and the growth of that country was absolutely enormous. And so the government decided to try to take measures to make that stop and to curtail that population growth. One of the things they did is they instituted what was called the one-child policy. Now, contrary to popular belief, the government of China never told people that it was illegal to have more than one child. What they did was, if you had one child, they would lower your taxes, which is good because they wanted to encourage people to have a child. But if you think about that, when two people have one child, if you do only that every generation, your population essentially gets cut basically in half, generation to generation to generation. And when your population is exploding the way that it was in China, ultimately encouraging people to have one child is a good thing. So they lowered the taxes for people having one child. If you had more than one child, for each additional child that you had, basically they would double your taxes every time you had another child to make it incredibly expensive for people to continue to have more and more and more children and to add to China's population growth. In addition to that, they undertook a propaganda campaign to convince people that having one child was really the best idea and the best option. Now, if we go back to the chart, though, what you can see is during the time in which the one-child policy was in effect, it really didn't have very much of an effect on the population growth rate in China. You can see that when the Chinese population really starts to decrease is right around the 1990s, and the thing that really helped to make that happen was the special economic zones. Now, this particular one is the Shanghai Special Economic Zone. When I show this picture to most of my students, they don't believe that this is China. They don't believe that this modern, wealthy, sophisticated city in China is a real thing, but it absolutely is. This is Shenzhen. This is the modern China. And really what we've seen is that as capitalism has helped to increase in the special economic zones, the production of China and the wealth of China and the ability of people in China to reach the middle class, the decision that those individual people have to make is, do I want to still be in the middle class and do I want to live in a nice apartment with a TV and a PlayStation and internet access and go to the movies and go out to eat, twice a week? Or do I want to continue to have more and more and more children? And really the incentive to stay in the middle class, that's what's really been pushing people in China to limit their reproduction and to curtail China's growth rate. And one of the things that we see is, as a result of that, China's population growth is actually slowing down to the point where by the end of this decade, by 2030, the expectation is that China's population is going to hit ZPG, zero population growth. And in fact, in the 2040s and the 2050s, China's population is expected to start shrinking and decreasing as more and more people enter the middle class and stop having so many children. This population bomb in China is expected to get better. Now, Along those same lines, we're going to talk just briefly about the modern country of India, because in India, what we see is a very similar trend when it comes to their population, except whereas China is getting its population growth under control, India, unfortunately, is not. And in fact, there's been an update to this data where the original expectation was that India was going to overtake China as the world's most populous country in 2030. Today, the expectation is that India will become the world's most populous country in 2024. So we're talking about by the time my freshmen this year are graduating from high school, we're going to see India become the world's largest and most populous country. Now, and you can also see that India's population growth rate is not slowing down anywhere near the way that China's is. Now, that produces a couple of really interesting problems. One interesting problem is, yes, India is a second tier not population, but a second tier economic country. It's part of what are called the BRICS countries, which is the second tier. It's not the top countries in the world, but it's the second tier up and coming countries in the world. And here what you can see is India really does have a massively growing economy. Because they were early adopters of the Green Revolution and could feed their people, it did, of course, lead to the population continuing to explode, but we've also seen a massive increase in the Indian gross domestic product. However, just because the country is getting wealthier doesn't necessarily mean that everybody is following along. And one of the modern problems in India, of course, is slums. We see enormous slums inside of the country of India. Slums are, of course, places that people didn't necessarily design. It's just places that grew up out of a need to house lots and lots and lots of people. Many slums actually originally grew up in garbage dumps because that's where people had access to resources to be able to feed themselves, house themselves. And so essentially what we see inside of especially the big cities in India is this massive explosion in people living in slums. And some of these slums number, in terms of population, into the millions. And this is something that we really don't see in very large numbers in the United States especially, but really in the Western world, where people are living in these particular types of conditions. And of course, it's really sad and it's really, really difficult, and these people have a really hard time getting out of this particular situation. One of the things you have to realize, though, as well, is that this leads us into a situation which we call the cycle of poverty. When you grow up in a situation like this, one of the things you have to realize is, how do you get out of this situation? Well, going to school is really, really difficult because, of course, inside of these slums, we see enormous amounts of child labor. Children have to work just to be able to support their families. And when they're working instead of going to school, they can't qualify themselves to get better jobs and to raise their standard of living and to get out of the slums. And so what we are starting to see is that this slum living condition is becoming cyclical, where families are being trapped generationally, one after another, unable to get out of the slums. And of course, the other problem is that people in the slums tend to have the highest population growth rates, which only puts additional pressure on families to be able to sustain themselves and helps to keep this problem getting worse and worse and worse. Now, a secondary problem that we see, which is related both to the slums and to the poverty, is inside of India, we see a huge problem with what we call street children. The estimates are that street children number in the millions. And one of the really, really big issues is a lot of these street children are supporting themselves sometimes, but we'll get to that in a second, through just begging. They'll stand outside of the airport, they'll stand outside of local venues, and they'll beg for money. Now, one of the real problems is inside of these slums, of course, we have major problems with things like gangs, street gangs. Street gangs understand that children earn a lot more money begging than other people do. And so one of the rackets that those Indian street gangs in the slums run is they will actually put children out on the streets to beg, and then they will take the money from them. About 15 years ago, those Indian street gangs found out and realized that children who had visible scarring and deformities actually earned a lot more money begging than other children do in those slums of India. And so one of the things that those street gangs started to do was they started to mutilate and scar children, particularly facial scarring, and one of the really common ways of doing that is through acid. When people have visible facial scars, it really lends a lot of compassion to other people who feel bad and so ultimately give money. However, one of the things you have to be really careful of is that money is not always going to help support the poor, the person who is actually begging for it. Many of these people are being used by street gangs in the slums of India. So even though India is a large, growing country with a growing GDP, it's the world's largest democracy, it still has some pretty major problems that are preventing it from becoming that kind of first world country that we all hope that India eventually gets to be one day. So I hope this video was informative for you. I hope that you like it. If you do, leave a like. Make sure you hit that subscribe button so that you're getting notifications for when the new videos pop up. And I will see you in the next video, which is going to be all about Latin America and its struggles with democracy. Stay healthy and stay safe, everybody.